But I want to mention 5 reasons that Paul is not confining or limiting women in these verses. 5 reasons. And I think you've already got some of them as we were talking here. But here are my 5 reasons that I would sum up of why Paul in these passages, 1 Timothy 2, 11, 12, is not in any way limiting the ministry of women, the leadership of women in the church. First of all, we mentioned this, but we must remember 1 Timothy is a personal letter written to an individual. It was not originally written to a church. It was written to an individual, Timothy. And this would indicate that Paul is addressing personal issues related to Timothy. And in his unique situation of confronting those situations in the church in Ephesus. So that in itself indicates that Paul was not writing a manual of church order for all churches everywhere, because this is a personal letter written to an individual who's relating to a unique situation. Second reason, not only is this a personal letter, but chapter 1 and verse 3, which we read at the beginning, indicates that Paul is addressing a particular problem that is plaguing the church in Ephesus, and what he writes must be considered in the light of this real-life, local situation in Ephesus. Okay? I think we made that point earlier, but it's obvious that Paul is writing this letter to address problems, particular problems, in the church in Ephesus at this time. Number 3, we mentioned this, the word translated authority in verse 12 is not the normal word for authority and is found only here in the New Testament, indicating that Paul is not addressing the normal exercise of authority in all the churches. And I want to emphasize this again because this is so important. And this is something that you can use just this one word, because it raises the question. Verse 12, I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority, to have althentane over a man. Althentane, the word for authority here, is not found anyplace else in the New Testament. The normal New Testament word for authority is exousia. For those who say that this applies to all women everywhere, then why did Paul use a unique word that neither he nor any other biblical writer ever used? The fact that he used this unique word shouts to us that he is addressing a unique situation that Timothy is dealing with in Ephesus. Wow! It shouts to us that. It's a unique situation that called for a different, unique word that was appropriate for that situation. Number 4, when Paul comes to the passages in question, he switches from addressing women, plural, to addressing a woman, and also the verb, where I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority. It's in the verb permit is in the present ongoing sense. Literally, I am not now permitting a woman to teach or to have authority. And then my number 5 would be that Paul, in his other letters, recognizes women who function in various authoritative roles of leadership. And these must be given equal weight when considering if the New Testament imposes limitations on the role of women in the church. So the very fact that in other letters, Paul recognizes women who functioned in leadership must be taken into consideration. Now, here's what some people do with this verse. Without considering any kind of context, without considering any intention on the part of Paul of why he wrote this letter, they just pull these verses out and they make that their canon within the canon. Now, what do you mean, Eddie, by a canon within the canon? They take this passage and they subject every other passage to this verse. No matter what any other passage says about a woman being an apostle or a woman ministering or Jesus sending Mary Magdalene to preach the gospel, the first news of the resurrection, all of those verses become secondary and are made subservient to this one verse. This becomes the controlling verse for certain people for the whole Bible. That is wrong. Even if you don't look at the context in which this was written, it still should be given only equal weight with other passages, and then conclusions drawn when equally considering what all the other passages say. Now, I'm saying my fifth reason why Paul is not confining the leadership of women in this verse is that in his other letters he recognizes women who function in authoritative roles. For example, I'll just do three quick examples in his letter to the church in Rome, Romans chapter 16, verse 1. Romans chapter 16 and verse 1. And Paul says in Romans 16:1, I commend you to Phoebe, our sister, who is a servant of the church in Cenchrea. I think it is so interesting. This word servant is a translation of the Greek word diakonos. And this is a legitimate translation. But here's what is so interesting. Because of what Jesus said about whoever wants to be great, let him become a diakonos. Diakonos became a word for those who were ministers of the word and ministers of the gospel. And so the King James translators, I think it's 23 times in the New Testament, especially in the epistles, they translate the word diakonos when it refers to men 23 times as minister. In this one place where the word is related to a woman, they translated it servant. Isn't that interesting? 23 times they translated the word diakonos as minister when it was used of a man. And in this one place where it's used of a woman, Phoebe, they chose to translate it as servant. But Paul says who is a servant, or we could say who is a minister of the church in Cenchrea, that you may receive her in the Lord in a manner worthy of the saints, and assist her in whatever business she has need of you. Now, Phoebe, obviously, even up to this point, she is a leader. Paul refers to it as a diakonos, so we could say a servant, a minister of the church in Cenchrea. And he exhorts the church to receive her in a respectful and worthy manner. And he exhorts them to assist her, to help her, give her whatever assistance she needs in whatever business she has need of you. For indeed she has been a helper, very interesting word, of many and of myself also. She's been a helper. It's the Greek word protastes. It's a feminine form of protastes, which literally means to stand before. And the Greek lexicon defines this word as a woman set over others. Isn't that interesting? The word literally means to stand before. So obviously she's been some kind of a leader. It also defines this word as a guide, a leader, and it does use the word a woman set over others.
I think we have to be careful to interpret that word in light of the full context of the gospel message of Jesus, where he didn't put one over another.
And that is so true, Sue,
because I know some women have taken that word and used it to promote their right to stand as bishops or archbishops or over in a hierarchical sense.
Right.
And we're not promoting that. That can be derived from that word if you take the word out of the context of the New Testament.
One of the things that is so needed is to put the whole New Testament ideal of church in context.
That's right, Eddie.
Because so many even reference books will give their definitions of words based on the idea that the New Testament church was some kind of hierarchical structure, which we know is not true. It wasn't a hierarchical structure, it was a movement. Now, but anyway, the point is she was a leader. She was a leader. Now, someone say, but it doesn't say she was a pastor. Well, I'll say to you like I said to a man in a class I had one time where I was teaching on this very passage of 1 Timothy 2, 11 and 12, and I was telling them some of these same things I'm telling you. And there was a man in the class, he actually was a brother from Africa. I think he was probably in his 40s, and he'd been a pastor. And he was very troubled to hear that women were not confined and restricted in what they could do in the church. And so, after spending, I think, 2 or 3 days, I opened it up for questions. And he raised his hand, and I could hear the frustration in his voice. And he said, can you show me one place in the Bible where a woman ever functioned as a pastor? I replied, if you will first show me one place where a man ever functioned as a pastor. But he was shocked and silent. He couldn't think of any place, because there isn't any place. In all of Paul's letters to churches, he never addressed his letters to Pastor so-and-so, never even mentioned Pastor so-and-so. And so I said to this brother, I said, look, I'm not trying to embarrass you, but I just wanted to demonstrate how much of our own perceptions about church and ministry we are reading into the biblical text. The fact is that there are many words that Paul uses for leaders, but he doesn't necessarily use all the ones that we use on a common basis. And so this woman was a leader, and she was a leader of enough prominence that Paul exhorted the church in Rome to assist her in whatever business she has need of, because she has been a prostates. She has been a leader, a guide, a benefactor for many, including myself also, Paul says. Wow.
And so could we say that a good translation of that word might be standing with? She has stood with me?
Yeah.
Is that safe?
That could be, yeah. We could use that.
I just thought of that.
Yeah,
she
good
stood
point.
with Paul, so stand with her.
So here's a woman leader that Paul recognizes, clearly recognizes. And then verse 3, Greek Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers, my co-workers. Here is a word of equality. And it's sun energos. Sun means with. My with workers, my workers with, my co-workers. It's a word of partnership. And both Priscilla and Aquila, Paul presents them on an even plane with himself. They are my sun energos, my co-workers, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus. And notice the pronouns are all plural. Who risk their own necks for my life, to whom not only I give thanks, but all of the churches of the Gentiles likewise greet the church that is in their house. It's interesting, Paul mentions both Priscilla and Aquila together whenever he mentions them. They're always together. But it's interesting here, he's greeting the church that is in their house. And in that culture, it was the cultural convention and the thing of etiquette to mention the man first. But Paul purposely reverses the cultural convention and mentions Priscilla first. It's interesting, I was reading a very popular, it's an older edition, older multi-volume set of word studies from the Greek by William A. Vinson. And I happened to come across this, and he was no egalitarian, but even he said that because Paul reversed the cultural, conventional way of presenting a man and woman, he put it something like this, indicates that Priscilla was the more active one in the church that was in their house. In other words, she was probably what we would call the pastor. Wow. So here's another woman leader. Greet Mary, who labored much with us in the Lord. Who labored? The word labor in Scripture, when it's talking about laboring in the gospel, it's talking about teaching, preaching, discipling, all of those things. Remember the prayer of Jesus? Pray the Lord of the harvest that He will send forth laborers into His harvest. Here is a woman named Mary that Paul says labored much with us. He's not talking about carrying our suitcases, cooking our meals. He's talking about teaching, preaching, discipling. The very thing that Jesus prayed, pray ye therefore the Lord of the harvest, He'll send forth laborers. Paul on different occasions mentions women who labor with him in the gospel. Greet Andronicus and Junia, my countrymen and my fellow prisoners, who are of note among the disciples. And most of you already know something of the fact that Junia is a feminine name, and it's verified by every ancient Greek manuscript has the feminine word Junia. The early church up until the Middle Ages recognized this as a female apostle.
In my blue book, I have the date and the person who first changed that. I can't locate it for this time, but it's there in the Spirit we're equal.
I would like to just look at 2 more verses here. Verse 13, that's a good point, Sue, thank you. In your blue book, In the Spirit we're equal, you deal with that very thoroughly. Verse 12 says, Greet Tryphena and Tryphosa, 2 women who have labored in the Lord. Labored in the Lord. What does that mean, labored in the Lord? Hey, teaching, preaching, discipling, pastor. These women were laboring in the Lord. No wonder when Saul of Tarsus, during the book of Acts, when he received papers from the high priest in Jerusalem that he could arrest, he made it clear that he was authorized to arrest both men and women. Why? Because women were so involved in propagating the good news of Jesus Christ. Here's a couple of them here, Tryphena and Tryphosa. Then verse 13, Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother, and mine. I have a whole thing of where I believe I can identify who Rufus was, but I'm not going to go into it. Paul never mentions about a spiritual father having one, but it does mention here a woman. He refers to her as his mother. Now, it's obviously not his biological mother.
Well, Jesus said, those who know my word and follow it, they're my mother. So
That's right.
He
right.
redefines mother, so
Yeah.
Paul is probably using that definition.
Yeah, it's a metaphorical term.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I just wanted to point this out. Verse 13, Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother, and mine. Paul said it's Rufus's mother, but she's my mother. What do mothers do? Well, they nurture, they teach, they guide. This mother of Rufus, who most likely was the wife of Simon of Cyrene, who carried the cross of Jesus, and I take that from the Gospel of Mark. Mark was in Rome when he wrote his Gospel, and he mentioned Rufus, who was the son of Simon. But nonetheless, Paul mentions this woman who's had this nurturing, guiding, mother-like, pastoral-like role in his life. Wow. And I'm just saying, here's a few examples of all these places where Paul recognizes women in roles of leadership. And so it's one more reason. It's the 5th one I have here on the list. That in 1 Timothy 2:11 and 12, Paul was not shutting women out of any kind of leadership teaching roles in the church. Instead, he was addressing a specific, particular situation that was going on in the city of Ephesus at the time of his writing.